welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber CRISC Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. In IT operations, it's essential to know the difference between an incident and a problem. In other words, understanding both short-term impact and long-term cause is critical. An incident is an unplanned interruption or reduction in service. In other words, it's an event that needs immediate attention. A problem is the underlying cause behind one or more incidents. In other words, it's what creates recurring risk if not fixed. Incident management is reactive. It focuses on quick containment and service restoration. In other words, it deals with the now. Problem management is proactive. It looks for patterns and root causes to prevent repeat failures. In other words, it prevents future incidents. Both are essential to risk management. On the CRISC exam, expect questions that link these processes to control effectiveness and exposure management. In other words, exam scenarios often explore both symptoms and sources. Incident management plays a direct role in risk response. In other words, how you respond affects how much damage is done. Its main purpose is to contain the issue, reduce impact, and restore service fast. In other words, the goal is to stop harm and resume function. To do that, you need predefined workflows, trained responders, and escalation paths that guide action. In other words, response must be planned in advance. Incident management is also tied to disaster recovery plans, business continuity, and crisis communications. In other words, it connects to broader resilience. If this process fails, organizations suffer more than just downtime. They face reputational damage, financial loss, and compliance scrutiny. In other words, incident failures become business-level crises. On the exam, failed incident response often reveals gaps in planning, testing, or governance oversight. In other words, failure often points to missing preparation. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Every incident management plan includes common components. In other words, each step helps limit damage and restore function. First is detection, either through monitoring systems, alerts, or user reports. In other words, you can't respond if you don't see it. Next is classification. That means deciding how urgent and how impactful the incident is. In other words, not all incidents are equal. Then you assign and escalate. The right team gets the ticket, and it moves up if it's critical. In other words, ownership and escalation happen fast. Communication is also vital. Internal updates, external notices, and stakeholder alignment all happen in real time. In other words, everyone must know what's happening. Finally, resolution must be followed by documentation and closure. This ensures traceability, accountability, and learning. In other words, you close the loop with evidence. On the CRISC exam, you'll often be tested on what step went wrong, usually detection, prioritization, or communication. In other words, scenario clues show where the process broke down. Metrics help measure how well your incident process is working. In other words, you improve what you can track. Mean time to detect, or MTTD, shows how fast you notice problems. In other words, how long the system was unaware. Mean time to respond, or MTTR, shows how fast you react. In other words, how long until someone acts. You'll also want to track the number of critical incidents, how many were escalated, and whether incident trends are improving or worsening. In other words, volume, severity, and trend all matter. These numbers show not just speed, but control, health, and readiness. In other words, metrics reflect how well systems and people perform. On the exam, look for answers that include time-based metrics and tie them to risk visibility. In other words, monitoring and measurement are part of maturity. Problem management is about fixing what's behind the incident. In other words, go deeper than the symptom. It identifies root causes, things that aren't obvious but repeat often. In other words, look for the pattern. Common tools include the 5 whys, fishbone diagrams, and structured interviews. In other words, tools that help explore cause and effect. The goal is not just to patch symptoms, but to redesign the process or controls that fail. In other words, prevention, not just recovery. Good problem management may trigger a control redesign, a policy update, or a change in the risk register. In other words, the outcome is a safer system. On the exam, look for patterns that ask, why does this keep happening? That usually means the problem, not just the incident, was missed. In other words, root cause was overlooked. The problem management process has 5 major steps. In other words, it has a clear sequence. First, identify the problem. Use incident trends, logs, or user feedback to spot recurring issues. In other words, detect patterns. Second, analyze the root cause. Dig deep to understand what really failed, not just the surface error. In other words, don't stop at the obvious. Third, apply workarounds if you can't fix it right away. These reduce impact while you work on a solution. In other words, buy time safely. Fourth, implement the fix. That could mean a system update, a policy change, or a control redesign. In other words, change the environment. Finally, verify and close the issue. Ensure that the solution worked and that the same issue won't happen again. In other words, validate success. CRISC questions about process improvement or recurring failure often point to weak problem management. In other words, process quality equals resilience. CRISC focuses on how incidents and problems reinforce the risk lifecycle. In other words, every failure is a risk signal. Each incident should be linked to a specific risk in the register. That way, the exposure is tracked and traceable. In other words, the record shows accountability. If a major incident occurs, you must reassess the related risks, likelihood, and impact. In other words, update risk scores when conditions change. Lessons learned from problems should inform your control tests, your treatment plans, and even your BIA. In other words, failures drive improvement. When you see systemic problems, escalate them to risk committees. Don't let them stay hidden in IT. In other words, governance must be informed. On the exam, look for connections between events, register updates, and control improvements. In other words, strong answers show lifecycle awareness. Modern environments use ITSM tools to manage incidents and problems. In other words, automation supports structure. ServiceNow, Jira, and others help automate alerting, ticket creation, status updates, and audit trails. In other words, reduce manual error. These platforms should integrate with GRC systems, so every incident can link to a risk or control. In other words, combine operations and governance. If an incident happens and doesn't get logged, that's a missed opportunity to learn and a governance failure. In other words, invisibility increases exposure. On the exam, when you see incident wasn't recorded, assume the organization is losing data, insight, and traceability. In other words, missed logging equals missed learning. Communication is not optional. It shapes how stakeholders view your risk posture. In other words, silence causes confusion. Every incident needs a communication plan that covers status, timeline, and impact. In other words, keep people informed and prepared. That includes users, executives, vendors, and possibly regulators. In other words, talk to everyone affected. Use templates, predefined messages, and escalation paths to avoid confusion. In other words, prepare your messages in advance. Trust and perception are affected by what you say and what you don't. In other words, communication shapes reputation. On the exam, strong answers include both technical response and stakeholder engagement. In other words, include both action and explanation. The CRISC exam questions often test incident and problem decision-making. In other words, they explore how well you manage disruption. If they ask what caused the outage, look for weak change control, misdetection, or alert misclassification. In other words, find the first failure. If they ask what step was skipped, consider whether escalation, documentation, or verification was missed. In other words, check the process. If they ask how to prevent recurrence, focus on problem management, not just faster incident response. In other words, treat the root, not just the symptom. If risk exposure increased after the event, it's probably because the incident wasn't linked to the risk register. In other words, the learning wasn't recorded. Best answers show speed, documentation, accountability, and learning. In other words, manage the full loop from detection to resilience. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal CRISC Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, Visit us at baremetalsire.com.